Chapter 2, England and its American Colonies, 1607 to 1732. This slide lists the core objectives for this chapter. You should review these before you read the chapter and make sure that you can answer all of these objectives before taking your tests. The early Chesapeake, the founding of Jamestown. Colonization by England was expedited by the development of joint stock companies at the beginning of the 17th century. A joint stock company is similar to a corporation today. It's where risk can be spread out among many investors. Before the creation of joint stock companies, individuals took on full responsibility, and like with Roanoke, those founders lost all of their investment when the colony collapsed. So the joint stock companies encouraged investment in colonization. In 1607, the Virginia Company financed an expedition to the New World to develop a colony with three major goals. The first was to find a northwest passage. It was believed in Europe at this time that there must be a body of water that cut across the North America continent. And so there was a lot of time and money spent by the English and the French, especially, searching for a northwest passage. The second was to find gold. Since the Spanish had found gold in South and Central America, it was also widely believed that there must be more gold and silver throughout the continent. And so a great deal of time is going to be spent searching for gold. The third objective of the colony was to develop a colony that could produce goods for England that England could not produce for herself. During this time, of course, we're in the age of mercantilism, which we'll talk about more in detail later. And so the goals of countries was to become self-sufficient. So if they could produce things in their colonies that they could not produce for themselves, that would keep them from having to buy from their foreign competition. In 1609, there was a very difficult winter in the Jamestown colony, and this winter of 1609-1610 became known as the starving time. During this winter, all foodstuffs just dried up among the colonies. The colonists had spent so much time searching for gold and silver that they had not planted a great deal of crops. They had relied a lot on the Native Americans to get things like corn, during the winter, the Native Americans had migrated to warmer climates. Many of the animals went into hibernation or also migrated, and so the colonists, because they had not prepared for cold weather, began to starve. They began to have to eat whatever they could find. They ate the horses, dogs, mice, whatever they could find. There were even some reports of cannibalism during this very difficult time. When the winter was over, the colony had lost most of its settlers. They had been reduced from 500 settlers at the beginning of the winter to about 60 by the time the spring of 1610 hit. So the founders of Jamestown had to make a decision. Would they continue with their investment in the colony, or would they just pack it in and say, you know, we tried, we've lost too much time and money, and give it up? Well, the Jamestown settlers decided that they would continue with the investment, and so they're going to bring more settlers to the colony in the spring and summer of 1610. When the founders of Jamestown decided to keep the colony going, and they brought the new settlers in after that difficult winter of 1609-1610, they placed Captain John Smith in charge of the colony. And Smith made new rules that encouraged everyone, or required everyone, to farm. One of the rules was, if you don't work, you don't eat. This way, workers would not just spend all their time searching for gold and silver. They would also have to farm and look out for the benefit of the entire colony. He also made alliances with Chief Paul Hatton of the local tribe to help Chief Paul Hatton would help the settlers learn to grow more of the local crops like maize. He also would help them learn to grow things like tobacco, which eventually would become a cash crop for the colony. The founders of Jamestown also, to encourage more settlement, they implemented what they called a head right system. This was a land grant policy where if settlers would come and they would bring more settlers with them, they would be given large grants of land for them to farm. The thing that really made Jamestown grow and prosper was the development of tobacco. John Rolfe also worked with the local tribes, and they taught him how to grow tobacco, and he took the strand of tobacco that the locals grew and taught that to the settlers at Jamestown. And Jamestown finally had a cash crop. They had something that would help them make money, and this encouraged more investment into the colony. Tobacco was a crop that required a great deal of labor, and so more laborers were brought in to work the crops, and the first form of laborers that were brought in to work the crops were indentured servants. Indentured servants were usually poor Europeans who were had no hope of really improving their lot in life as long as they stayed in Europe. And so they were willing to sell themselves into servitude for a period of 5 to 7 years. During that period of their indenture, their servitude, they were virtually a slave, but it was for a limited time. When their indenture was over, the 5 or 7 years, they would be given their freedom, and many of them moved into more of the interior regions of the colonies, and they became small farmers themselves, which eventually created a middle class in America. Two significant events happened in Jamestown in 1619. The first was creating the Virginia House of Burgesses. The Virginia House of Burgesses was the first elected legislature in the New World. The colonists needed a way of making laws and rules for themselves, and since they had the heritage of Parliament in England, they borrowed this idea and they created a legislative body for their colony. Of course, the Virginia House of Burgesses was still subservient to England and Parliament, but it was a means for the colonists to make rules and laws for themselves for the betterment of Virginia. The second big event that occurred in 1619 was the bringing in of African servants into the colony. He used the term African servants in the beginning because the records are not clear whether these were indentured type servants or if they were slaves for life. The records just indicate that a Dutch warship sold 20 Africans in Jamestown in 1619. So we're not clear of the status of those Africans in 1619. But what we do know is by 1660, the terms servant for life was being used, or what today we would call slaves. So in that 40-year period, we're not quite sure of the status of the Africans, but we do know by 1660 slavery was a part of the way of life in Virginia, and it was spread to Maryland and the other Chesapeake colonies. This slide just shows the first American colonies from Great Britain. It shows Jamestown and Plymouth and the land in between the areas, which were claimed by both eventually. This slide shows the second southern or Chesapeake colony, Maryland, and you can see that it is just north of Virginia and it is along the Delaware River. The second English colony was the one that we're actually usually a little more familiar with. It's actually the Plymouth colony that was founded by what we call our Pilgrims in 1620. The Pilgrims were actually Puritans who wanted to reform or purify the Anglican Church, hence the term Puritan. The Pilgrims were actually separatist Puritans. That meant they wanted to actually separate from the Anglican Church and form a whole new type of church. For that reason, they were persecuted in England. And they had actually left England and moved to Holland and lived for a number of years in Holland because Holland allowed more religious freedom. But after a number of years, the Pilgrims became concerned that their children were losing their English identities, and so they petitioned the Virginia Company for the rights to build a colony in Virginia. And so the Virginia Company granted them a land grant. The Pilgrims left Holland on the Mayflower in 1620. And they were blown a little off course, and so instead of landing in the Virginia colony, they arrived north of Virginia colony in what today is Massachusetts, and they called it Plymouth. They realized very early that they were not where they were supposed to be, so before the men debarked from the ship, they wrote up a form of government, what they called the Mayflower Compact. The Mayflower Compact first established that the colonies would be loyal to the king, so they're not separating from King James at this time. They pledged their loyalty to the king, and they also pledged that they would make laws that were good for the benefit of the general good of the colony. And for that reason, we say that the Mayflower Compact is the foundation, really, of American democracy, because the Mayflower Compact establishes the precedent in America that government rests upon the consent of the governed. That means that the government, the body of laws that we have to be created by the people. And so this is really the foundations of what eventually becomes the Declaration of Independence, and then later, of course, the Constitution. After the success of the Plymouth colony, more Puritans from England began to look at establishing another colony in the New World. That colony eventually becomes known as the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and it was established by the Massachusetts Bay Company, which was, like the Virginia Company, a joint stock company. The Puritans in England were experienced a great deal of persecution still during this time period. This is when Charles I is king, and he is very anti-Puritan. And so the Massachusetts Bay Company, which originally actually wanted to colonize for monetary reasons, took up the cause of the Puritans and gave the Puritans a land grant in the New World. John Winthrop became the first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And over a period of about 20 years, we have what's known as the Great Puritan Migration, where thousands of Puritans, about 20,000 Puritans, will migrate from Great Britain to the New World. The Puritans created what we now call the Congregational Church. Sometimes we just refer to it as the Puritan Church. And in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the colonists had to be members of the Puritan or the Congregational Church. So they did not create what we consider to be religious freedom today. You had to be a member of this church. If you were not a member of this church, you were kicked out of the colony, you were banished, you may be put in jail, they may try to convert you to their religion, but it was definitely not the religious freedom that we think of today. In many ways, the Massachusetts Bay Colony is what we called a religious oligarchy. An oligarchy is a form of government that is ruled by a group, an elite group of people, and so this was a religious oligarchy, meaning it was ruled by the church. It in the religious oligarchy, oftentimes the religious leaders, like the ministers, don't hold political positions, but they have so much influence that the government really reflects the ideas of that one religion. An example, of course, would be that the Puritan religion was really running the government, in that if something was considered by the Puritan church to be immoral, it actually became illegal. Many of you have probably read The Scarlet Letter when you were in high school. And in The Scarlet Letter, the main character goes to jail, and then she is eventually banished from the colony because she commits adultery. Adultery was considered to be an immoral act by the Puritan church, and so thus it became illegal, and that's why she was kicked out of the colony. Also, in a religious oligarchy, you usually have to be a member of a certain religion in order to vote or hold any political office. And so in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, only members of the Congregational Church could vote or hold political office. And membership in the church was very selective. Today, when we think about being a member of a church, we become a member by simply starting to go to that church, joining that church. But in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, you had to be selected to be a full member of the church. Everyone was required to attend the Congregational Church, but only certain people became members of the church. In the beginning, it was probably only about 1% of the population had full membership. So we're talking about a very small group that's running the colony. Eventually, by the time we get to the American Revolution, that number had greatly increased, where most people could vote in the colony because they were members of the church, but they had more selective membership in order to hold political office. Like the Virginia colony, the Massachusetts Bay Colony also created a legislature. Theirs was called the General Court. They also had town meetings that became very popular in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The Bay Colony is going to have several towns. Plymouth eventually is absorbed by the Massachusetts Bay Colony. We're going to have Boston, Salem, and so each of these individual towns would have town meetings where they made rules for their own town. Then the town representatives would select people to go to the general court and represent that town at the general court when they would meet, and then the general court would make rules for the entire colony. This map just shows us some of the major colonies that became what we call the New England settlements, and we're going to be talking about all of the New England colonies as we proceed through the chapter. One of the things we see about the Massachusetts Bay Colony in it being a religious oligarchy was that they did not allow any religious dissent in the colony, and you were not allowed religious freedom, as we talked about, but you were also not allowed to criticize the church, meaning the Congregational Church during this time period. There was no free speech as we know it today. So we began to see that there was some growing religious dissent in the colony, people becoming more unhappy about the restrictions in the colony. And one of the main individuals here was Roger Williams. Roger Williams was actually a Puritan minister, but he had become disturbed that he felt that the Puritan church was losing sight of its true goal, which was to save souls, and that it had become so entrenched in punishing people and for violating government laws that they were not going out and trying to save people. Instead, they were punishing, and it was becoming too secular, too involved with the government. he was very critical of the church, and for that he was banished from the colony. Many of the followers of Roger Williams went with him, and he created a new colony called Rhode Island. And one of the big things that we see that he made sure he put into Rhode Island was this very sacred idea in America of the separation of church and state. People were allowed freedom of conscience or freedom of religion in Rhode Island. However, most of the people did continue to be Puritan, but they didn't have to be. And he made sure that the church was a separate entity from the government or the state. Another dissenter was Anne Hutchinson. Anne Hutchinson was considered a real troublemaker in the Bay Colony because she was, first of all, a female who spoke out against the church, and then she had some rather radical ideas. She felt that people could find God without a minister, so she did not feel that you needed to go to a particular church or go to the Congregational church in order to find God. And for that reason, she was also banished from the colony. She and her followers first established a settlement in New Hampshire, at Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and then she eventually was killed by some Indians or Native Americans, and then some more of her followers spread out and made another settlement in Maine. The third one of our religious dissenters that broke away from the Massachusetts Bay Colony was Thomas Hooker. Thomas Hooker was also a Puritan minister like Roger Williams that had become critical of the church. But he is different in that he is not banished from the colony. When he felt that his ideas were becoming so different from the Congregational government, that he went to the leaders of the colony and asked for permission to leave, and they gave him permission. And he created the colony of Connecticut. One of the things that we see coming from Connecticut is the first written constitution of modern democracy. He wrote the Fundamental Orders, sometimes referred to as the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, writing down the charter or the constitution for the Connecticut colony. And this, of course, is another foundation of American government, to have a written constitution. As we look at the New England colonies as a whole, we see that they have some very common things among them. There are a lot of family farms in those regions, small family farms though. People are not growing crops to sell, they're growing crops for their own use. And for that reason, you have more diversified agriculture. You're going to have beans and squash and things of that nature that people can eat and grow for their own benefit. You're not going to have the large plantations that grow up in the Chesapeake regions with the tobacco plantations. The populations in New England grew very rapidly, partially because of the Great Puritan Migration. So a lot of people came to that area, and you had all those towns in the Bay Colony, and then with the growth of New Hampshire and Connecticut and Rhode Island, there were many places for the people to go. We see in New England, towns are more common than we're going to see in the southern colonies. And this is mainly because one of the major economic endeavors of the New England colonies was fishing. And so you have a lot of these fishing villages. While agriculture was limited to the very small farms for individual usage, fishing does become a commercial endeavor. And so you have these large fishing vessels that will go out, and so you have many people that will be on those ships at a time, and so those people are going to live in towns. And so because you have the towns, You're going to have more things like schools and churches, people living closer together, and being much more unified than we're going to see in the southern colonies. Okay, now we're going to move back to the southern colonies. The second of the southern colonies was Maryland. Maryland was founded during the time of King George I in 1632. It was founded by the Calvert family. George Calvert was a prominent aristocrat in England, but he was also Catholic. He was friends with Charles I, and so he went to the king and asked him for permission to build a colony in the New World that could be a haven for Catholics, a safe place for Catholics to live and worship. And so Charles I gave him permission to build this colony. In the early years, it was what we called a proprietary colony. It was under proprietary rule, meaning that the Calvert family had full control of the colony. Eventually, it will revert back to a royal colony after the English Civil War, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But it is a haven for Catholics. Unlike the Massachusetts Bay Colony, though, the Catholics took religious toleration more literally, like we believe today. And so they welcomed people of all Christian religions to the colony. For that reason, by the time we get to the 1640s, there were actually more Protestants than Catholics living in the colony. And some of the colonists became concerned that the Protestants would start making laws outlawing Catholicism. So in 1649, we get the Religious Toleration Act. Sometimes it's just referred to as the Toleration Act. The Religious Toleration Act allowed for the freedom of worship for all Christians in Maryland. So it's not complete religious toleration. It would not allow non-Christians like Muslims or Jews to worship in the colony. But there were not many Jews or Muslims that were migrating to North America during this time period. So it would allow religious toleration for most people within the colony. Maryland is going to develop much like Virginia. It's going to have a tobacco economic base, and with that tobacco economic base also we will see the development of large plantations based on the slavery labor system, and so slavery will begin to grow throughout the Chesapeake region and eventually to all the southern colonies. After the founding of Maryland, we're going to see that there's going to be a period of about 20 to 25 years where there are no new English colonies established. This was because of the English Civil War, where Charles I was overthrown because of his autocratic rule in the country, and he eventually was executed. And Oliver Cromwell and the Puritans, who had been greatly persecuted by Charles I, took over the colony. And so during the period of the Cromwellian Protectorate that lasted until 1660, we're not going to see any new colonies established. By 1660, Oliver Cromwell was getting old, and he was losing a lot of popularity because he had established a lot of very strict rules on the colony, and ironically had even begun to do many of the things that the Puritans had accused Charles I of. And so in 1660, the monarchy was restored to Great Britain, and so we have then what we call the Restoration Colonies. Charles II, who was Charles I's son, who had been living in France during that time, will now come to the throne, and it is under Charles II that we will have the creation of the Carolinas. At first, Carolina was one large colony, and it was established by a group of investors. One of the leading investors was Sir Anthony Ashley Cooper. They employed John Locke to write up a charter for the colony, They gave some incentives for settlement, and one of those was that there would be religious toleration. The Carolinas had a difficult time in the beginning uh, because as we moved into the southern regions of Carolina, tobacco did not grow very well. In the northern regions, tobacco grew well, but because of the mountain ranges, they could not have large plantations. So Carolina was slow to develop at first. Eventually, they developed two new cash crops, rice and indigo. Indigo is a type of dye that was used very commonly during this time period. And once rice and indigo were introduced to the colony, especially the southern portions of the colony began to really grow and develop. Because of the way the governmental charter was written for the Carolinas, the more land that people owned, the more political power they had. South Carolina began to outshine North Carolina, and there began to be dissent between the North and the South, the Northerners feeling that the South was making all the rules for them. So eventually, as we move into the early 1700s, around 1720, it was decided to split North Carolina and South Carolina, and so that's how we got two colonies out of Carolina. This map just shows us some more of the early settlements in the South. You can see by the time we have this map created, South Carolina and North Carolina have been separated. Virginia is above North Carolina, and then we will have Georgia, which will be below South Carolina, which we will talk about eventually. In addition to creating the Carolinas, Charles II is also going to be responsible for acquiring the New Netherlands. The New Netherlands is had been the colony that belonged to the Dutch, but the English had wanted it, especially after they began to develop more colonies in the north and colonies in the south, and here we had this Dutch colony that were separating that area. So Charles II is going to devise a rather clever way of getting the colony. Charles II always was wanting for money. He was kind of the party boy of Europe at this time, and by the time we get to the mid-1600s, it's pretty evident that Charles is not going to have any legitimate heirs, and so his brother, James, who is the Duke of York, will inherit the throne. And James was a much more settled individual. He was married. He had two daughters. And so Charles told James that if he could take the New Netherlands from the Dutch, that he would give it to him so that James would have more money to live on. And James thought this was a very good idea. This meant he would have to finance the expedition out of his own pocket. And so he will finance an expedition to capture the New Netherlands from the Dutch. He captures New Amsterdam, which was New York at the time. And he met very little resistance from the Dutch. When the English warships sailed into New Amsterdam, the governor of the New Netherlands tried to rally the Dutch to fight the English, but the Dutch settlers, having been surrounded by the English settlers for quite some time, felt that they might actually be better off having English rule, because the English had allowed these legislative bodies in their colonies. So the Duke of York was able to capture the New Netherlands, and he renamed it New York because that was his duchy, so it became New York, and New Amsterdam became New York City. The Duke of York was really only interested in what today is New York State. So he divided the colony, and two areas that had been part of the New Netherlands became two new English colonies. New Jersey and Delaware, and he gave New Jersey and Delaware to two of his friends. One of those friends eventually sold what was New Jersey to William Penn. William Penn was a very wealthy Quaker, and Penn had been wanting to build a colony for Quakers in the New World. He thought and hoped that that colony could be New Jersey, but New Jersey already had a lot of its own culture by the time William Penn acquired it, so it could not become the Quaker colony that he hoped it would be. William Penn, as it would be, was a good friend of Charles II, James's brother. And so Penn had the idea of going to Charles and asking Charles to give him another land grant where he could build a Quaker refuge. And Charles thought this was a good idea because the more colonization in the New World, the more money that the English crown made from these colonies. He also felt it would be a good time for him to get rid of his debts to the Penn family. Charles was always borrowing money from his friends, and William Penn was one of those friends that he owed a great deal of money to. So one of the conditions of him giving Penn what eventually became Pennsylvania was that Penn had to forgive his debts, and Penn felt that that was a pretty good trade-off. So he was granted the very large land grant that eventually became Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania was known as the Holy Experiment by a lot of the people at the time. They were actually making fun of Penn because when Penn created the colony, he established what was known as the Charter of Liberties. And under the Charter of Liberties, there would be religious freedom for all Christians. He also established that anyone who owned a small amount of property or paid taxes could vote. So he was granting a lot of liberties, giving a lot of freedoms to people. And because of that, a lot of people didn't think the colony could work. Because at this time, a lot of people felt that if you were poor, you were also ignorant. And that was one of the reasons they did not allow poor people to vote in Europe. And so people thought, well, you're going to have all these people from all these different religions, and you're going to have all these poor people voting, and your government's going to be a mess. But it actually worked very well. And people from all over Europe, not just from Great Britain, but all over Europe, began to migrate to the Pennsylvania colony. Penn also established a bicameral legislature, which is a legislative body that has two houses, which of course has become the model for the American legislative system. The capital of Pennsylvania was Philadelphia, and this holy experiment that people had made so much fun of actually worked very well. By the time we get to the American Revolution, Pennsylvania is the most prosperous of all the English colonies, and Philadelphia is the leading city in the colonies, even outstripping New York City as being the most prosperous city. The last of the 13 original English colonies was Georgia. Georgia was not established until 1732, about 50 years after the founding of Pennsylvania. And it was founded for a couple of different reasons. James Oglethorpe and the investors that he represented envisioned Georgia as being a buffer zone between South Carolina, which was becoming a very prosperous colony, and the Spanish colony of Florida. And so Georgia had this military rationale by creating this buffer zone to protect South Carolina. But Oglethorpe and the founders also wanted Georgia to be a haven for debtors. At this time, people who could not pay their debts were usually put into prison, what they called debtor's prison. And Oglethorpe and some of the more enlightened individuals in England at the time felt that this was actually creating more of a burden on English society. You're putting people in jail because they're poor and they can't pay their debts, and then the government is having to take care of them. So they came up with the idea that giving these small, petty criminals, these debtors, this option of, instead of going to prison, that they could go to Georgia. Georgia would not be for hardcore criminals. That's going to be Australia, but it will be for the small petty criminals. And so they were given this land grant to build Georgia. They learned a lot from William Penn about offering incentives and developing a colony that gave people reasons to come. And so some of the incentives that they gave to people that would come to Georgia, besides the debtors are going to be their labor source, but they want more enterprising individuals to come also. And so they gave them incentives, one of which was free passage to the New World. They would also give each adult male 50 acres of land to start farming on. And they would give them agricultural implements, seeds, fertilizer, that type of stuff to get started farming. And they would give them support until the first harvest. This way they're hoping that they can get a group of small, middle-class farmers that can farm 50 acres, get them to come in and make the colony productive. However, they also place some restrictions on the colonies. They don't want huge plantations to develop because they want to offer opportunity to a lot of people. So they restricted the amount of land that individuals could own. Individuals could only own 500 acres of land. And while we think of 500 acres of being a lot of land today, if we look at some of the plantations in South Carolina, they were 1,000 acres, 1,200 acres. They were huge. So this would give you small plantations, not large plantations. They also prohibited slavery in Georgia initially. Since they were trying to find jobs for these debtors that are coming here to work instead of going to prison, they said slavery would be too much competition. So slavery was initially prohibited in Georgia. And they also prohibited rum, brandy, and other hard liquors, what they called intoxicants. You could still have wine, you could still have ale or beer, but the hard liquors were restricted in Georgia. After a number of years, the people in Georgia began to complain about some of the restrictions. So by 1740, we see that they began to take away some of these restrictions. In 1740, they increased the amount of land that individuals could own to 2,000 acres. 2 years later, they lifted the restriction on alcohol. And in 1749, they removed the restrictions on slavery. So after 1749, we see that Georgia begins to develop much like all the other southern colonies, using the slave labor system as its primary labor source. This chart gives us a year-by-year founding of English colonies throughout the New World. You'll see that Jamaica and some of the Caribbean islands are also included in this map, but it gives you the name of the colony, the date of its founding, what religion was most prominent in that area, what was the major economic endeavor for the area, and what kind of government that it had.